Hello everyone, and welcome to my YouTube channel called Living in Hayward, Wisconsin, where we talk about all things real estate related and also just about living in Hayward. I'm Audrey Miller. I'm the broker owner of Northwest Wisconsin Realty Team. We're located right on Main Street in downtown Hayward. I'm your local real estate expert, and today we're going to talk about closing costs. What are they? Who typically pays for them? And just everything else related to closing costs when it comes to purchasing a home or a property in Wisconsin. So thank you for joining me here today. As always, feel free to subscribe, like, or share my channel if you enjoy the information that you see on here. Check out my other videos. Feel free to leave a comment below and I'd be happy to hear from you. Also, if you're looking to buy or sell, as always, feel free to reach out to me directly and I would love to help you with that process or answer questions that you might have. So anyway, today we're going to talk about closing costs. I get questions about this quite a bit. You know, there's a lot of things that most consumers and the public who aren't in real estate don't quite understand about the buying and selling process, and closing costs can be one of those things. And sometimes I'll have people say to me, oh, I'm going to ask the seller to pay for my closing costs. Or in the past, I've asked the seller to pay for my closing costs. And then we kind of have to get into that discussion as well. So first of all, there are two parts of closing costs. There is the, what I would call the real estate transaction related closing costs. And then there is the lender related closing costs. A lot of times people get those two things confused, or they don't realize or understand the distinction. So if you're not purchasing a property that you're getting financing for, the closing costs are going to be less, obviously, because you don't have the lender closing cost side of things for your loan. So to break it down, the real estate closing costs are going to include title insurance, gap insurance, the Wisconsin state deed transfer fee, commissions to the agents who are involved in the transaction. That's basically on the real estate side of things. There's also the proration of the property taxes, but that's kind of, I wouldn't really consider that to be a closing cost. It's just part of the closing statement. And then you also have your title company fees for them doing the work to make sure you have a clear title. On the lender closing cost side of things, that is whatever your lender is charging for closing costs. That can vary quite a lot depending on the type of loan. You know, the lender itself, some people have closing costs for lender side of things as low as $1,500 to $2,000. I've seen them for certain types of loans with borrowers with low credit. I've seen the closing costs be as high as $7,000 to $8,000. So it just depends a lot on what your program is that you're getting and which lender you're working with. So plus the lender closing costs on the buyer side, you have homeowners insurance that you typically need to obtain and prepay at least for a 6-month period of time. And then you also have escrow potentially for property taxes starting out right away. So these are things that are typically paid for by the buyer, the lender closing costs and the associated fees. In addition to that, the buyer will have a very small deed recording fee, which would be around $50. They typically would pay for that. If you're buying, that would be an additional cost. And then sometimes your agent that you're working with, their firm may have an admin fee that they charge, and that is typically on top of the negotiated commissions. So to break it down in terms of who typically pays for what, the lender closing costs and the associated items that I just discussed would typically be paid by the buyer. Now, if a buyer wants to ask the seller to pay for that, they can do that. There's a spot on our forms where it's called seller concessions towards buyer lender closing costs and prepaids. Prepaids being like the homeowner's insurance or escrow for property taxes, etc. However, in a competitive situation, you typically do not want to ask the seller to pay that without increasing the amount of your offer. So essentially, let's say the property is listed for $200,000, but you have $5,000 in closing costs for your lender that you want to ask the seller to cover. That would be fine, but the net effect to the seller is going to be $195,000. In a competitive situation, it's going to disadvantage your offer. So you may want to consider raising your offer price to $205,000. The seller pays your lender closing costs and prepaids, and the seller still nets the $200,000 prior to their real estate closing costs. So hopefully this isn't getting too confusing for everyone, but that is typically all handled by the buyer unless they add it into the offer to purchase. Now keep in mind, when you do that, you're adding one more wrinkle for the seller, which is that now the property has to appraise a little bit higher than it would have had to for someone who is not rolling their lender closing costs into the offer. So now to get into the seller side of things, typically, or what I would call the real estate transaction closing costs, you will have, as I mentioned, title insurance, gap insurance, the state transfer fee, which is $3 per thousand of the sale price of the property. That's a mandatory transfer fee. You have the title company costs, and then you also have the real estate commissions. Now, written into the boilerplate of our offer in Wisconsin is that the seller pays for the title insurance, the gap insurance, the title company fees, and the state transfer fee. That is written into the boilerplate. So sellers already, in Wisconsin, sellers already cover all of those real estate transaction related fees. So I don't think that I've ever seen a transaction where a buyer was covering any of those costs. And now commission is the other thing. And typically this is a significant amount for the transaction. And this is where the new law changes that went into effect on August 17th are going to impact what I'm about to say. But in the past, sellers have negotiated with their listing agent, not the buyer's agent, but with the listing agent, how much the buyer's agent is going to be paid if there's one involved. And they also have historically paid all of those commissions. So a buyer essentially was able to come and look at a property, have an agent represent them, and the seller would take care of paying that buyer's agent through a relationship between the two firms that each agent worked for. So in the past, buyers have not had to worry about paying any commission to their agents. So again, when you look at the closing costs on the seller side, the seller would typically have significantly more closing costs than a buyer in a transaction in Wisconsin. Now with the new changes, and if you haven't heard about this or don't know what I'm talking about, the NAR did a lawsuit settlement, and as part of that, the NAR and the DOJ are requiring agents to have a written agreement with a buyer before showing a property, and we no longer have this dynamic of knowing through the MLS what the other party, as in the seller, is offering to pay us if we're working with the buyer. So these are major changes, and I did a whole video on this a few weeks ago, probably around the beginning of August of 2024. And feel free to watch that for more information about these changes. There's a lot of insight in that video as well. But now how it's working, the seller may or may not offer a concession towards the buyer agent commissions. And so we have to take this now on a case-by-case basis in terms of whether or not the seller is offering to pay any compensation to a buyer's agent. If they're not, we can still write it into the offer, but your agent is likely going to be not only having a written agreement with you prior to showing a property, but a lot of times that's going to be a buyer agency agreement, which is also going to include language about the cost that you as a buyer may incur to pay your agent if the seller, or in the event the seller is not offering it, or you cannot roll it into your offer. So there's a new, our forms have changed because of this recent change in the laws. So now we have a line item within our offer that says seller agrees to pay X amount of compensation to the buyer's agent. So far, and we're only a couple weeks into this change, a lot of sellers are still choosing to offer to pay a buyer's agent at least something because it helps them to bring more buyers to their property. So there's definitely an advantage to that. If you're a buyer listening to this and are like, oh my gosh, now I have to come up with my real estate closing costs, I have to come up with my down payment. Because when I'm talking about closing costs, the down payment is not part of that. That is a separate, I guess you could call it a closing cost, but really that's your down payment on your loan. So besides your lender closing costs, your down payment, your prepaids, you may also need to pay your buyer's agent. But don't be too scared. Like I said, a lot of sellers are still offering those concessions. If not, it can be written into the offer, or we can do the same thing that I just talked about a bit ago with the lender closing costs. We could increase the amount of the offer to include a compensation for a buyer's agent if the seller is unwilling to pay that themselves. So that's been a big shift in who pays what in closing costs. But when you talk about the term closing costs, that's two little words, but really inside of that, there are two major divisions between real estate closing costs and lender closing costs. And then there are also a lot of categories and subcategories within those two divisions. So it's a big term, and what I've often found that people think is that the closing costs are all of it. When they say, I want to ask the seller to pay their closing costs, they're thinking of the real estate side, which is already typically taken care of by the seller. But really, a lot of times what buyers are wanting is for the seller to cover their lender closing costs so they can come with less out of pocket to the closing table. Sometimes I say it takes an army to get a real estate transaction completed, between your agents, your seller and buyer, your lenders, your title company folks, and even some other parties that help out throughout the transaction. There's a lot of things that are going on. There's a lot to know, and this is yet another reason why you want to be represented as a buyer or as a seller. It gets pretty confusing for those who don't do this on an everyday basis, and it's also a reason to hire an experienced agent when you're looking on the buyer side of things, because they can walk you through every step of this process, way beyond this explanation of closing costs. They can let you know who pays for what throughout the transaction, what the steps of the transaction are, how to negotiate, how to navigate challenges that come up during the transaction. And I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but there's a statistic out there that says that when it is a transaction without an agent involved, there is a 70% higher chance that the transaction will fail. And this is simply because the general public is not a professional at handling a transaction and knowing how to navigate through the challenges of a transaction. And that's to be expected. That's why we have the training, the experience that we do. And when you bring a professional on board, whether the seller is paying that compensation or you are choosing to pay that compensation or you're writing it into the offer for the buyer's agent, it's just a great idea to have somebody on your side who knows what they are doing. You know, a seller will continue to pay the listing agent no matter what. So if there's a negotiation going on with your agent, that would be on the buyer side. Unless a seller is selling for sale by owner, then they are definitely going to have an agent involved and going to be paying that agent. So hopefully this was helpful to define closing costs and who pays for what typically and what is involved in closing costs. As always, feel free to subscribe, like, share my channel. You can comment below. I am a wealth of information and knowledge regarding real estate and about living in Hayward, so feel free to reach out anytime to me directly, text, call, or email me. Again, I'm Audrey Miller, broker owner of Northwest Wisconsin Realty Team, and thank you for joining today.